In the spring of 2023, something unusual was happening in Washington, D.C. The air felt heavier than usual, not just because of the rising humidity, but because of a quiet storm brewing around one of the most powerful institutions in the country, the United States Supreme Court. For months, headlines had been piling up like unread mail, each one revealing another troubling detail about how the justices lived, who they spent time with, and what they accepted without telling anyone. Private jets, luxury vacations, secret gifts from wealthy donors with strong political agendas. These weren't rumors, they were facts, confirmed by investigative reporters and watchdog groups. And slowly, Americans across the country began to wonder, if the highest court in the land wasn't playing by the same rules as everyone else, who could they trust? The Supreme Court had always been seen as a place above politics, a marble fortress where 9 wise figures interpreted the Constitution with fairness and distance from the noise of everyday life. But that image was cracking. Public confidence in the court had dropped to historic lows. Polls showed that fewer than half of Americans believed the justices acted in the public's interest. Some even questioned whether the court was becoming a tool for the very wealthy and well-connected. Cloaked in black robes and legal jargon, into this tense moment stepped a congresswoman from Texas who had spent most of her life in courtrooms, but not the kind with marble columns and velvet drapes. She'd worked as a criminal defense attorney in Dallas, representing people who couldn't afford lawyers, people who'd been failed by the system again and again. She knew what it felt like when justice wasn't blind, when it looked at your bank account, your skin color, your last name, and made up its mind before you even spoke. That experience had shaped her, and now as a member of Congress, she carried that same sense of urgency into every hearing, every vote, every question she asked. She hadn't set out to become a national figure. She'd simply believed that if you saw something wrong, you had a duty to say something, especially when you held a position that gave you a microphone. And in early 2023, she saw something deeply wrong. While ordinary federal judges were required to follow strict ethics rules, disclosing gifts, avoiding conflicts of interest, stepping aside when their impartiality could be questioned, the Supreme Court operated with no formal code at all. Nothing binding, nothing enforceable, just a set of vague guidelines that the justices could follow. Or ignore. That didn't sit right with her. Not when the court was making decisions that affected millions, on voting rights, on health care, on the environment, on the very future of democracy. If the justices were making life-altering rulings, shouldn't they also be held to the highest standard of transparency? Shouldn't the American people know who was influencing them, even indirectly? So when the House Judiciary Committee announced it would hold a rare hearing on judicial ethics and that it would invite a sitting Supreme Court justice to testify, she knew this was more than just another meeting on Capitol Hill. This was a chance to ask the hard questions no one else seemed willing to ask. And she began preparing, not with flashy sound bites, but with stacks of documents, court records, news reports, and legal analyses. She read about private flights to luxury resorts, about undisclosed speaking fees, about friendships between justices and billionaire donors whose cases sometimes ended up before the court. She didn't want to accuse. She wanted to understand. But more than that, she wanted accountability. The idea of a Supreme Court justice testifying before Congress was almost unheard of. Justices prized their independence. They rarely appeared in public, let alone under the bright lights of a congressional hearing room. But the pressure had become too great to ignore. After months of public outcry and growing bipartisan concern, even some Republicans had started calling for reform. The court couldn't stay silent forever. And so Justice Coney Barrett agreed to appear. Not because she wanted to, but because the moment demanded it. Barrett was a figure of quiet intensity. Appointed to the court in 2020 after the death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she had quickly become one of its most influential conservative voices. Known for her sharp intellect and deep Catholic faith, she rarely gave interviews or made public statements outside of court opinions. She carried herself with a calm reserve, as if the weight of the robe she wore demanded silence as much as speech. Many admired her discipline. Others wondered if that same reserve masked a lack of transparency. As the hearing date approached, Washington braced itself. Legal scholars debated whether the event would lead to real change or just more political theater. Pundits filled airtime with speculation. Activists organized rallies outside the Capitol. And inside congressional offices, staff members worked late into the night, drafting questions, rehearsing responses, and trying to anticipate every possible twist. For the Congresswoman from Texas, there was no grand strategy, just a simple belief. If you're in a position of power, you owe the people honesty. She didn't plan to shout or grandstand. She knew that real power often lies in calm, precise questions that can't be easily brushed aside. She also knew that millions would be watching, not just in the US, but around the world. This wasn't just about one justice or one hearing. It was about whether the American system still worked for everyone, or only for those at the top. In the days leading up to the hearing, she walked through the Capitol halls with a quiet focus. She passed portraits of past lawmakers, marble statues of founding figures, and tourists snapping photos with wide eyes. But her mind was elsewhere, on the notes in her folder, on the timeline of events, on the exact wording of her questions. She wanted to be fair, but she also wanted to be clear. There would be no room for vague answers or legal dodges, not this time. Outside, the city buzzed with the usual chaos: honking cars, street vendors, protesters with handmade signs. But inside the hearing room, an unusual stillness was beginning to form. Chairs were arranged in neat rows. Microphones were tested. Cameras were positioned. And though the room was empty, it already felt charged, as if the walls themselves knew something important was about to happen. The Congresswoman took a deep breath. She thought about the clients she'd represented years ago, the ones who never got a fair shot, the ones who trusted the system until it failed them. She thought about her constituents back home, working long hours, raising families, hoping their government would protect them, not protect itself. And she thought about the promise she'd made when she first ran for office, to speak for those who couldn't get a seat at the table. This hearing wouldn't fix everything. No single moment could, but it could be a start. It could remind everyone, justices, lawmakers, citizens, that no one is above the rules. That transparency isn't weakness, it's strength. And that democracy only works when people believe it's fair. As the sun set over the Capitol dome that evening, casting long shadows across the National Mall, she closed her notebook and headed back to her office. Tomorrow the world would be watching. Tomorrow she would look a Supreme Court justice in the eye and ask the questions millions were too afraid or too powerless to ask themselves. And whatever happened next, one thing was certain: the silence around judicial ethics was finally breaking. The stage was set. The players were ready, and in a city full of power, one voice was about to cut through the noise, not with anger, but with truth. The morning of the hearing dawned gray and sticky, the kind of Washington spring day where the air feels thick before the rain even starts. Outside the Dirksen Senate office building, crowds had already begun to gather, some holding signs calling for judicial reform, others just curious to catch a glimpse of history. Cameras lined the sidewalk, reporters adjusted their earpieces, and Capitol Police stood alert but calm. Inside, the usual bustle of aides rushing with folders and coffee gave way to a hushed energy. Like the building itself was holding its breath. Upstairs, in the hearing room, staff moved quickly but quietly, making last-minute checks. Chairs were straightened, water glasses filled, microphones tested with soft taps that echoed off the high ceilings. The room wasn't a courtroom, not technically, but it carried the same weight. Long wooden benches, American flags in the corners, portraits of past committee chairs watching from the walls. It felt like a place where decisions were made, where power showed its face. Justice Amy Coney Barrett arrived just before 9. She stepped out of a black sedan in a navy suit and her signature black robe. Unusual for a congressional hearing, but a quiet statement all the same. She didn't wave or smile for cameras. She simply walked with purpose, flanked by 2 aides and a U.S. Marshal, her expression unreadable. Reporters shouted questions as she passed, but she kept her eyes forward, her posture straight, as if moving through a storm without getting wet. Inside the building, she was escorted through a side entrance away from the public eye. In a private holding room, she reviewed her notes one last time. She wasn't nervous, she'd faced tougher rooms than this, but she knew the stakes. This wasn't just about her. It was about the court's image, its independence, its future. She believed deeply in the institution she served. To her, the lack of a formal ethics code wasn't negligence, it was tradition. The justices policed themselves. They didn't need Congress telling them how to behave. Meanwhile, down the hall, the congresswoman from Texas sat in her own small office, sipping black coffee from a paper cup. She'd been up since before sunrise, running through her questions again and again in her head. Not to memorize them. She didn't want to sound rehearsed, but to make sure each one cut to the heart of the issue. She wasn't trying to trap anyone. She just wanted answers. Clear ones, honest ones. She thought about how strange it was that this moment had even come to pass. For decades, Supreme Court justices had operated in near total privacy when it came to their personal conduct. No financial disclosures beyond the basics, no requirement to explain who paid for their travel, no obligation to recuse themselves unless they chose to, and yet their decisions shaped everything, from whether a woman could get an abortion to whether a corporation paid its fair share in taxes. The power was immense. The oversight, almost non-existent. She smoothed her blazer, checked her notes one last time, and stood. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor as she walked toward the hearing room. Along the way, she passed interns wide-eyed with excitement, veteran staffers with tired smiles, and fellow lawmakers offering quiet words of encouragement. She nodded but didn't stop. Her mind was already in that room, already at that table. By the time she entered, most of the committee members were already seated. The room hummed with low conversation and the occasional burst of laughter, a nervous habit before serious things begin. She took her place at the long dais, arranging her papers just so. To her left and right, colleagues chatted or scrolled through phones, but she stayed still, watching the empty chair at the witness table. That's where Justice Barrett would sit. That's where the questions would begin. At precisely 9:03 a.m., the gavel came down. The committee chair gave a short opening statement, laying out the purpose of the hearing, to examine the need for a binding code of ethics for the Supreme Court. He spoke carefully, balancing respect for the judiciary with concern for public trust. Then came the introductions, the formalities, the procedural pauses that always seemed to stretch longer than they should, and then she walked in. Justice Barrett entered through the back doors, calm and composed. She nodded slightly to the chair, then took her seat at the witness table. Cameras clicked. Pencils paused mid-air. Even the air seemed to still. She began with a prepared statement, measured, respectful, firm. She thanked the committee for the invitation. She reaffirmed her commitment to impartiality. She explained that the justices already followed ethical guidelines, based on those used by lower court judges. But when pressed, she admitted there was no enforcement mechanism. No one could compel a justice to step aside from a case. No one could demand a full accounting of their outside activities. It was all voluntary. That word, voluntary, hung in the room like smoke. As other lawmakers took their turns, the tone shifted. Some asked gentle, almost deferential questions, clearly wary of appearing to challenge the court's authority. Others leaned into the moment, citing specific reports of luxury trips funded by conservative donors, undisclosed speaking fees, and cozy relationships between justices and political operatives. But none went as far as the congresswoman from Texas was about to go. She watched quietly as her colleagues spoke, listening not just to the words, but to the silences between them. She noticed how Justice Barrett answered, always polite, always precise, but often circling back to the same point. The court's independence must be protected. She never denied the facts. She just framed them differently. A private flight wasn't a gift, it was hospitality. A vacation wasn't a conflict, it was personal time. And ethics? Those were internal matters not for Congress to dictate. But the congresswoman knew that for most Americans that explanation wouldn't hold water. If a local judge accepted a free trip from someone with a case in their court, they'd be investigated. If a city council member took luxury vacations from a developer seeking permits, they'd be recalled. Why should the highest court be held to a lower standard? When her turn finally came, the room seemed to lean in. Even the staff in the back stopped shuffling papers. She adjusted the microphone, took a slow breath, and began, not with an accusation, but with a question. "Justice Barrett," she said, her voice steady. In 2022, you flew on a private jet owned by a billionaire who has donated millions to conservative causes, including groups that file amicus briefs before the Supreme Court. You didn't disclose that trip in your annual financial report. Can you help us understand why? Barrett paused. Just a second, but it felt longer. Congresswoman, she replied, I relied on the advice of court counsel at the time. We considered it a personal arrangement, not a reportable gift under existing guidelines. But those guidelines aren't law, the Congresswoman said gently. They're suggestions, and if the public sees a justice vacationing with donors whose interests regularly appear before the court, doesn't that create at least the appearance of bias, even if none exists? Again a pause. Barrett chose her words carefully. I understand the concern, but I assure you, my decisions are based solely on the law and the facts before me. The Congresswoman nodded. She didn't argue. She just asked another question, this one about a speaking engagement at a private club known for its political fundraising. Then another about recusal standards. Each question built on the last, not with anger but with quiet insistence. She wasn't trying to embarrass. She was trying to clarify. And in doing so, she forced a conversation the court had avoided for decades. Around the room, people exchanged glances. Some looked uncomfortable. Others scribbled furiously in notebooks. A few even nodded along, as if hearing these questions out loud finally gave voice to their own unease. Justice Barrett remained composed throughout. But those watching closely could see the tension in her jaw, the slight tightening of her hands on the table. This wasn't hostile, but it was relentless. And for the first time in a long while, a Supreme Court justice was being asked to explain, not just declare. When the Congresswoman finally said, "Thank you, Justice," and leaned back, the room exhaled. The spell hadn't been broken, but it had been tested. And in that moment something shifted, not in the law, not in the court structure, but in the air itself. The idea that the Supreme Court was untouchable above scrutiny began to crack, just a little. As the hearing continued with other lawmakers, the energy never quite returned to where it had been. The Congresswoman sat quietly listening, but her mind was already racing ahead. She knew this was just the beginning. One hearing wouldn't fix decades of opacity, but it had opened a door. And now millions of people watching at home on lunch breaks, in classrooms, in living rooms across the country, had seen something rare, a powerful institution being asked to answer for itself. Outside, the clouds finally broke and a soft rain began to fall, but inside the real storm had just started to gather. The moment the Congresswoman leaned into the microphone, something changed in the room. It wasn't loud or dramatic, no shouting, no gavel slamming, no sudden outbursts. But everyone felt it, like the air had gotten heavier, or the lights had dimmed just enough to focus all attention on that one spot at the witness table. Justice Barrett sat perfectly still, hands folded, eyes steady. She'd faced tough questions before, in confirmation hearings, in oral arguments, in late-night study sessions as a law professor. But this was different. This wasn't about legal theory or constitutional interpretation. This was about trust. And trust, once shaken, is hard to rebuild. The Congresswoman didn't raise her voice. She didn't gesture wildly or lean forward like she was about to pounce. She just asked her questions, clear, direct, and backed by facts that had been buried in footnotes and financial disclosures for too long. She started with the private jet trip again, not to repeat herself but to press a little deeper. You said it was a personal arrangement, she said. But when that same donors foundation later filed a brief supporting a position the court ruled in favor of, how can ordinary Americans not wonder if that vacation played a role, even subconsciously? Barrett blinked once. Then she answered, calm as ever. My rulings are based on the law, not on who I've traveled with. I believe you think that, the Congresswoman replied. But perception matters just as much as reality when it comes to public confidence. If a local judge in my district accepted a free trip from someone with a case before them, they'd be removed. Why should the rules be looser at the top? That question hung in the air like smoke after a match is blown out. No one moved. Even the committee chair, who'd been glancing at his watch just moments before, sat up straighter. Around the room, aides stopped typing. Reporters stopped scribbling and just listened. Because this wasn't politics. This was principle. Barrett took a breath. The Supreme Court has always operated on a different model, she said carefully. We are not subject to the same administrative oversight as lower courts. Our independence is essential to our role. But independence shouldn't mean invisibility, the Congresswoman countered gently. You're not asking for less oversight, you're asking for none at all. And that's not how any other branch of government works. The president discloses gifts. Congress has strict ethics rules. Even federal agency heads have to recuse themselves when there's a conflict. Why is the court the only institution that gets TEE? She wasn't attacking. She was pointing out a gap so wide it couldn't be ignored. And in doing so, she gave voice to what millions had been feeling but couldn't quite name. That something about the system felt off. Like the game was being played with two sets of rules, one for everyone else and one for the 9 people in black robes. Barrett shifted slightly in her seat. I understand the concern, she said, and I take it seriously. But creating a formal ethics code enforced by Congress could threaten judicial independence. The court must remain separate from the political branches. Separate, yes, the Congresswoman said, but not secret. You don't have to give Congress power over your decisions to agree that the public deserves to know who's influencing your life outside the courtroom. Transparency isn't control, it's accountability. And accountability isn't weakness. It's what keeps democracy alive. At that, a few people in the audience nodded, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet tilt of the head, a small exhale of agreement. Because what she was saying wasn't radical, it was basic. If you hold power, you owe honesty. That's not partisan. That's human. Then she asked the question that would echo far beyond the hearing room. Justice Barrett, do you believe accepting these gifts, private flights, luxury lodging, all expenses paid retreats from people with clear stakes in your rulings, compromises the appearance of impartiality? The room went so quiet you could hear the hum of the air vents. Barrett didn't answer right away. She looked down at her notes, then back up. I do not believe it compromises my impartiality, she said finally. And I follow the guidance provided by the court's internal ethics practices. But those practices aren't public, the Congresswoman said. They're not written down in a way anyone can check. They're not enforced by anyone outside the court itself. So how can the American people verify that? How can they trust a system they can't see? Barrett's expression didn't change, but something in her posture did, just a fraction. A slight tightening of the shoulders, a pause a beat too long before she spoke again. Trust is earned through our work, she said. Through our opinions, our reasoning, our fidelity to the Constitution. And yet, the Congresswoman said softly, trust in the court is at an all-time low. Not because people doubt your legal skills, but because they feel shut out. Like the doors are closed, the curtains drawn, and only a chosen few get to peek inside. If the court wants to restore that trust, isn't it time to open those doors just a little? She didn't say it with anger. She said it with sadness. Because she wasn't just speaking as a lawmaker, she was speaking as someone who'd spent years in courtrooms where regular people showed up scared, confused, and hoping the system would treat them fairly. And now, she was watching the highest court in the land operate like it didn't need to answer to anyone, not even the people it was supposed to serve. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy, with meaning, with history, with the weight of a question that had gone unanswered for too long. Then the Congresswoman leaned back slightly, signaling she was done. Thank you, Justice, she said. I appreciate your time. Barrett gave a small nod. Thank you, Congresswoman. And just like that, the moment passed. But it didn't disappear. It lingered. In the way reporters glanced at each other as they packed up their gear, in the hushed conversations in the hallway afterward, in the texts flying between activists and legal scholars across the country, because what had just happened wasn't just another exchange in a long line of congressional hearings. It was a crack in the wall. Later that afternoon, clips of the exchange began spreading online. Not the full 2-hour hearing, just that 5-minute stretch where the questions cut deep and the answers revealed more in what they avoided than what they said. People shared it not because it was explosive, but because it felt honest, real, human. A teacher in Ohio showed it to her civics class. A retired judge in Florida called his grandson to talk about it. A young law student in California paused her studying to watch it twice, then posted it with a simple caption. This is what accountability sounds like. Back in the Capitol, the Congresswoman walked out of the building alone. No entourage, no cameras chasing her. She stopped for a moment on the steps, looking out at the crowd still gathered below. Some held signs that now read Ethics for All or Transparency Now. Others just stood quietly, as if they'd witnessed something important and weren't sure how to process it yet. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt tired, but also clear. She hadn't gone in there to score political points. She'd gone in to ask the questions that needed asking, even if the answers were uncomfortable. And in doing so, she'd reminded everyone watching that democracy isn't just about elections or laws. It's about who gets to speak and who has to listen. Inside the hearing room, staff began turning off lights and stacking chairs. But the echo of those questions remained, not because they were shouted, but because they were true. And truth, even when spoken softly, has a way of filling a room and then spilling out into the world. By evening, news anchors were replaying the exchange. Late-night hosts referenced it, legal podcasts dissected every word, and across kitchen tables and group chats, people were talking. Not about party lines or political strategy, but about fairness. About whether the system still worked for them. The courtroom hadn't been a real courtroom, but in that moment it had felt like one. And for the first time in a long time, the highest court in the land had been asked to stand before the people and explain itself. The freeze hadn't lasted long, but it had lasted long enough for everyone to notice, long enough for change to begin stirring quietly beneath the surface. Within hours, the internet lit up. Not with outrage or conspiracy theories, but with something quieter and more powerful: recognition. People weren't just sharing clips of the exchange. They were talking about what it meant. A high school teacher in Michigan posted a short video explaining to her students why this moment mattered. A retired postal worker in Arizona called his local newspaper to say he'd never paid attention to judicial ethics before, but now he couldn't stop thinking about it. A group of law students in Chicago organized a panel discussion titled, "When Power Goes Unchecked." The congresswoman didn't post anything herself. She went home, changed out of her suit, and sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, scrolling through news alerts on her phone. She wasn't looking for praise, she was watching for the ripple. And it was there. Not in grand declarations, but in small human reactions. A mother telling her daughter, "That's how you stand up for what's right." A veteran judge writing an op-ed saying, "Finally, someone asked the question we've all been avoiding." Even a few conservative legal bloggers, usually quick to dismiss congressional oversight as partisan theater, admitted the questions were fair and overdue. By the next morning, the hearing wasn't just a footnote in the news cycle. It was the story. Cable networks replayed the key moments. Podcasts dedicated entire episodes to unpacking the ethics loopholes that had existed for decades. Social media filled with infographics, showing how Supreme Court justices weren't required to disclose travel paid for by private donors, while members of Congress had to report a $50 gift card. The contrast was jarring, and for the first time it felt unacceptable. What made the moment stick wasn't the drama, it was the dignity. The congresswoman hadn't yelled. She hadn't called names or made wild accusations. She'd simply laid out facts and asked, "Does this seem right to you?" And millions of people answered, "No, it doesn't." In Washington, the reaction was more cautious, but no less significant. Behind closed doors, lawmakers from both parties began having conversations they'd avoided for years. A Republican senator known for his strict views on government ethics quietly told a colleague, "If we expect small-town judges to follow rules, why don't we expect the same from the Supreme Court?" A Democratic representative started drafting a bill to create a binding ethics code, this time with stronger language and clearer enforcement. Even the White House issued a statement saying the president supported greater transparency and accountability at all levels of government, a carefully worded nod to the growing momentum. Justice Barrett, for her part, returned to the court and said nothing publicly. But insiders noticed a shift. In internal meetings, she reportedly urged her colleagues to consider adopting formal guidelines, not because they'd done anything wrong, but because public trust was eroding and perception mattered. It wasn't a full reversal, but it was a crack in the wall of silence that had surrounded the court for generations. Back in Texas, the congresswoman's office was flooded, not with angry calls, but with messages of thanks. Constituents wrote letters, sent emails, stopped her in grocery stores. "You made me feel like my voice matters," one woman said, holding her toddler's hand. "I've never understood how the court works," admitted a retired firefighter. But now I get why it's important that they play by the same rules as the rest of us. These weren't political supporters or activists. They were regular people who'd tuned in because something about the moment felt personal. Because it was about fairness, and fairness is something everyone understands no matter their zip code or party. The media kept calling it the confrontation, but those who watched closely knew it wasn't a fight. It was a conversation, one that had been waiting to happen for decades. And once it started, it couldn't be stopped. Within a week, student groups on college campuses organized teach-ins about judicial ethics. High school debate teams added, "Should the Supreme Court have a binding ethics code?" to their tournament topics. Even late-night comedians, usually focused on punchlines, treated the moment with unusual seriousness. "It's not about left or right," one host said during his monologue. "It's about whether the people at the top think the rules apply to them too." The real test came in the halls of Congress. Bipartisan support for ethics reform, once a pipe dream, began to solidify. A group of lawmakers, some who'd voted against similar measures in the past, now said they were rethinking their position. One longtime senator, known for defending judicial independence at all costs, gave a speech on the Senate floor acknowledging that independence without accountability can become isolation, and isolation breeds distrust. The bill that emerged wasn't perfect. It didn't give Congress power to discipline justices. That would have crossed a line into judicial overreach. Instead, it proposed something simpler, a formal, publicly available code of conduct for the Supreme Court, modeled on the one already used by lower federal judges. It would require justices to disclose gifts, recuse themselves in clear conflict of interest situations, and submit to an independent ethics advisor when questions arose. No punishments, no removals, just transparency, just clarity. And for the first time, it had real momentum. The Congresswoman didn't take credit. She knew change like this never comes from one person or one moment. It comes from years of pressure, from watchdog groups filing reports, from journalists digging through flight logs and tax records, from citizens demanding better. She was just the one who happened to be at the microphone when the dam finally broke. Still, her role couldn't be ignored. Pundits noted how her background as a defense attorney gave her questions a different weight. They weren't theoretical. They came from someone who'd seen how the system fails real people every day. That grounded the whole exchange in humanity, not politics. Even legal scholars who'd spent careers studying the court admitted they were surprised by the public response. "We assumed people didn't care about judicial ethics," one professor said in an interview. But it turns out they cared deeply. They just needed someone to explain why it matters in plain language. And that was the key. The Congresswoman hadn't spoken in legalese or political jargon. She'd spoken like a neighbor, like a teacher, like someone who believed the American people were smart enough to understand fairness when they saw it, or its absence. As the weeks passed, the story didn't fade. It grew. News outlets followed up with investigations into other justices' undisclosed trips. A major newspaper published a timeline showing how often donors with cases before the court had hosted justices at luxury resorts. The facts were there all along, but now people were paying attention, and slowly the court began to respond. Not with a press conference or a statement, but with action. Behind the scenes, justices started consulting ethics experts. Drafts of a potential code circulated among clerks. Rumors swirled that the Chief Justice was pushing for adoption before the end of the term. It wasn't fast. It wasn't flashy, but it was happening. For the Congresswoman, the victory wasn't in headlines or applause. It was in the quiet moments afterward. The constituent who said she finally felt represented. The young lawyer who emailed to say she'd decided to specialize in government accountability because of what she'd seen. The high schooler who wrote a paper on the separation of powers and included a quote from the hearing. She knew the work wasn't done. A code of conduct was just a start. Enforcement would be the next battle. And cultural change, the idea that even the most powerful must answer to the people, would take years. But the silence had been broken. The assumption that the court was untouchable had been challenged. And once that happens, you can't unsee it. One evening, walking home from the office, she passed a group of teenagers sitting on a park bench, phones in hand, watching a clip of the hearing. One of them looked up and said, "That's the lady who asked the hard questions, right?" The Congresswoman smiled but didn't stop. She just kept walking, knowing that if kids were talking about judicial ethics over dinner or on a park bench, then something real had shifted. Not because of her, but because the moment was ready. And sometimes all it takes is one clear voice to say what everyone's been thinking. The ripple had become a wave, and it was still growing. Months passed. The cherry blossoms bloomed and faded. Summer heat settled over Washington, thick and slow. The news cycle moved on, to elections, to international crises, to the usual rhythm of political noise. But something had changed beneath the surface, quietly and permanently. The Supreme Court, once seen as a distant fortress untouched by public opinion, had begun to shift. It started with a memo. Not a grand announcement, not a press conference, but a quiet internal document circulated among the justices. Drafted with input from legal ethics experts and reviewed by the Chief Justice, it outlined a formal code of conduct for the court. It wasn't everything reformers had hoped for. There was still no independent enforcement body, no power to force a justice to step aside, but it was real. It was written down, and for the first time in the court's 234-year history, it was public. The code required justices to disclose gifts over a certain value, avoid accepting travel from parties with interests before the court, and consult an outside ethics advisor when potential conflicts arose. It borrowed heavily from the rules already followed by lower federal judges, rules that had worked for decades without compromising judicial independence. The language was careful, respectful of the court's role, but firm in its expectations. Most importantly, it acknowledged a simple truth, that public trust isn't automatic. It must be earned and maintained. When the code was released, the reaction was measured but meaningful. Legal scholars called it a historic step. Editorial. Boards praised it as long overdue. Even critics who wanted stronger measures admitted it was better than nothing, and far better than the total silence that had come before. The Congresswoman didn't issue a triumphant statement. She simply said, "This is what happens when people demand accountability, not because they're angry, but because they care." She knew this wasn't the end. It was a beginning. Real change doesn't happen in a single hearing or a single document. It happens in the slow, steady work of building new habits, new expectations, new norms. And now, for the first time, the Supreme Court was part of that conversation, not above it. Back in her district, life went on. She held town halls, met with small business owners, visited schools. But now, when people asked about Washington, they didn't just ask about inflation or border policy. They asked, is the court really going to follow those new rules? Or will they actually tell us who's paying for their trips now? The questions were specific, informed. That alone was a victory. It meant people weren't just watching, they were paying attention, and they had reason to. Within weeks of the code's release, Justice Barrett filed her first updated financial disclosure, including details of past travel that had previously gone unreported. Other justices followed. It wasn't perfect. Some disclosures were still vague, some trips still raised eyebrows. But the fact that they were being disclosed at all was a sea change. Transparency, once treated as a threat to judicial dignity, was now being treated as part of it. The Congresswoman kept pushing. She introduced new legislation to strengthen the code, requiring annual public reports, creating a nonpartisan ethics panel to review complaints, and mandating that any justice who violated the code would have to explain their actions in writing. The bill didn't pass overnight, but this time it had bipartisan co-sponsors. Even lawmakers who had once dismissed ethics reform as political grandstanding now called it common sense. What made the difference wasn't just the hearing, it was the way that moment connected with something deeper in the public imagination. People weren't demanding perfection. They were asking for fairness. And fairness at its core is simple. If the rules apply to everyone else, they should apply to you too, no matter how high your office or how heavy your robe. In classrooms across the country, teachers used the hearing as a case study in civic courage, not because someone shouted or made headlines, but because someone asked hard questions with respect and clarity. Students learned that change doesn't always come from protests or scandals. It can come from a well-placed question in a quiet room. One high school in Ohio even reenacted the exchange as part of a government unit. A student playing the Congresswoman stood calmly and asked, "How can the public trust a system they can't see?" Another, playing the justice, paused before answering, "Trust is earned through our work." The teacher later said the room fell silent, not because it was a performance, but because the students felt the weight of the moment. They understood, even at 16, that democracy isn't just about voting. It's about watching, listening, holding power to account. Meanwhile, the court itself seemed to carry a new awareness. In oral arguments, justices asked sharper questions about conflicts of interest. In classrooms across the country, teachers used the hearing as a case study in civic courage, not because someone shouted or made headlines, but because someone asked hard questions with respect and clarity. Students learned that change doesn't always come from protests or scandals. It can come from a well-placed question in a quiet room. One high school in Ohio even reenacted the exchange as part of a government unit. A student playing the congresswoman stood calmly and asked, "How can the public trust a system they can't see?" Another, playing the justice, paused before answering, "Trust is earned through our work." The teacher later said the room fell silent, not because it was a performance, but because the students felt the weight of the moment. They understood, even at 16, that democracy isn't just about voting. It's about watching, listening, holding power to account. Meanwhile, the court itself seemed to carry a new awareness. In oral arguments, justices asked sharper questions about conflicts of interest. In opinions, they cited ethics concerns more openly. And when a major case involving a billionaire donor's foundation came before the court later that year, one justice recused herself, citing the new code. It was a small act, barely noticed by the press, but to those who'd been watching, it spoke volumes. The congresswoman never claimed credit for all this. She knew better. Real change is never the work of one person. It's built by journalists who dig, by citizens who speak up, by lawyers who file public records requests, by students who ask why. At the dinner table, she was just one voice in a much larger chorus, but sometimes one voice is enough to start the song. Years later, historians would look back on that spring as a turning point, not because laws changed overnight, but because expectations did. The idea that the Supreme Court was beyond scrutiny began to fade, replaced by a new understanding that no institution, however noble its purpose, is above the people it serves. And in that overheated hearing room, where time seemed to stop for just a few minutes, something essential had happened. Not a battle, not a victory, but a reminder. A reminder that democracy only works when everyone plays by the same rules. That power without transparency becomes suspicion. That silence, when it comes to ethics, is never neutral. It's a choice. The congresswoman still walks the halls of Congress, still fights for the people who feel left behind. But now, when she passes the Supreme Court building on her way to work, she doesn't just see marble and columns. She sees a place that, slowly, is learning to listen. And in living rooms, classrooms, and coffee shops across the country, people still talk about that day, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. Because it showed that even the most powerful can be asked to explain themselves, and that in a democracy, that's not disrespect, it's respect for the system, for the people, and for the idea that no one is above the rules. The courtroom had frozen that day, but out of that stillness came movement, quiet, steady, and real. And sometimes that's how the deepest changes begin. Not with a bang, but with a question asked in a calm voice and the courage to wait for an honest answer.